from Texas is recognized for any questions he cares to pose.
I thank the chairman. Mr. Boyle, Standard & Poor's reduced the United States long-term rating to AA+. In their report, they say the downgrade reflects our opinion that the fiscal consolidation plan that Congress and the administrative recently agreed to falls short of what, in our view, would be necessary to stabilize the government's medium-term debt dynamics. Do you agree or not?
Well, I wasn't here in Congress in 2011, but what I do know is there's no question the reason for that default and the reason for that downgrade was because we came so close to default for the first time ever.
Mr. Smith?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Representative. In other words, the only major credit downgrade that we've ever had was because we weren't doing enough to manage our debt. We never defaulted. There was never a default. It's just they downgraded because we weren't doing enough to manage our debt.
The subsequent quote was making them, quote, pessimistic about the capacity of Congress and the administration to be able to leverage their agreement into a broader fiscal consolidation plan. In other words, they didn't believe that we would do what is necessary to get our fiscal house in order. I guess my question right now is, and the thing that I'm struggling on a nonpartisan basis, is whether this plan does that. And that's, I think, the question the American people want to know. Are we actually taking a step right now which will actually make our fiscal strength return again? And I'm asking just a general question, like just quick. I mean, yes or no? Do you guys think this bill? You guys are all advocating for this bill. Will this bill, if we pass this bill, is this going to restore fiscal health to the United States of America?
I would just say, in regards to, I would best illustrate it to our country's finances is like the Titanic. And you got to start moving the ship before you hit the iceberg. And this does help us start turning the ship. Does it turn it fast enough or far enough, as much as I would be happy to do? But we could probably turn it a whole lot faster if we had a different person in the White House and different control in the Senate. But it does turn it, but just maybe not as fast as all of us would like to turn it.
I would go even further.
Okay.
I think this bill, as I've said repeatedly today, is a compromise that will help us avoid economic disaster. Whether or not we can do what we need to do in order to get our fiscal house in order is dependent on each one of us. I don't think you can say, well, we got pay-go for the administration, but we don't have pay-go for the tax side in the House. We've got pay-go for the expenditure side on the programs, but not on the tax side. So we've got to be able to do everything, and we've got to be able to put everything on the table and look at everything and consider everything and act on everything collectively.
Mr. Thompson, if I might follow up real quickly, and I'll go down the line so you guys have a chance. Is it your position, I'm asking genuinely, that the current 19.6% of GDP revenue is insufficient?
I don't think I said that. What I said was there's more than one way to spend money in Congress, and that needs to be understood.
Okay, I guess my question, though, is on the tax side, because I hear a lot of my colleagues on the tax side. Yes,
May I address that specific point, because I know you've referenced this in our budget committee before. That statistic is out of date. It's actually fallen to 17.7. There was, for a brief period, it was at that elevated level. Unfortunately, we're no longer there. It is back to more the historic norm of 17.7.
My understanding is 19.6 is the 2022 level. We can talk about where it is in 2023, but the last data we have from 2022 is 19.6%. And by the way, even if it were 17%, that would be the historic average, as opposed to the 19.6, which would be in line with the high from World War II and 2000. Mr. Estes, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to address your original question around whether this bill helps our our fiscal house. It does help our responsibility to manage our finances. However, I will say this, the Limit, Save, Grow Act, which I voted for and supported, was a much better bill in terms of getting our economy moving forward and focusing on how to get our spending more under control. And it would be much better in doing that in terms of answering your question.
Well, thank you for that. And look, I think this is an important conversation for the American people to understand. We're not going through, you know, a full committee discussion, so this is going to be about it, right? And we'll get down to the floor if it gets to the floor, and then we'll have, you know, 2 hours equally divided or whatever it is that's decided in the rule, and then there'll be some speeches and some whatevers, and then everybody will try to get back for the week, right? That's the way this is going to unfold, and that's going to happen for something that is going to increase the debt limit by roughly $4 trillion. So I guess my question here is if we're looking at a debt ceiling increase, a debt limit increase, until January 1st of 2025, it is therefore technically uncapped. And to Mr. Smith's point, it then is okay, we've set a date, and now we're just going to do our spending thing that we do. And there's no real brakes on that besides ourselves, which has never proven particularly fruitful for the American people. And so we're going to have a date, and by most people's accounting, it's going to be upwards of $4 trillion. It could be high threes, it could be low fours, kind of depends on what we do through the appropriations process. But we're doing that, and by the way, we're doing that into a lame duck, which then leaves to the Secretary to make determinations about what is going to follow with respect to extraordinary measures, and make a decision based on a political outcome of the election in November of next year, then what we do. So we're setting this up for the classic Washington Christmas timeframe, end of the year, middle of a lame duck, not the kind of thing you would think we'd be doing. And the reason I started with that Standard & Poor's question, trying to calm things, trying to demonstrate a resolve to actually put our hands around this problem. Now, mind you, we barely touch anything in the mandatory world in this deal. We should, of course, be addressing mandatory spending as a conference and as a Congress. We're not really. To the extent we were going to, with Medicaid, we didn't. We walked away from it, right? In terms of work requirements on Medicaid and trying to deal with it, but we walked away from it. But okay, so we're not doing that. I think my question here is it your all's best guess that our debt to GDP ratio will be higher or lower on January 1st, 2025 than it is today in light of this bill? Any of the witnesses? Are we going to have a higher or lower debt to GDP ratio in January 1st, 2025? And not with a dependent on how we appropriate answer, but what are we actually going to end up with?
Well, Representative, the debt, the credit card is maxed out based on how Congress spends money. And so clearly that is the number one factor of how much debt is added to. But I will say this, that this bill will make sure that our debt to GDP ratio is better off than a blank check debt limit increase, which President Biden and the House and Senate Democrats have been pushing for.
So we agree that this is about prospective spending. Because I've heard a lot of folks talk about it being, making sure all this is about default. We're always talking about paying our bills. This is really about increasing the credit card for, generally speaking, prospective spending. Part of this is not just about the number change or the date change that would then increase the debt $4 trillion. It's obviously got some spending restraints in place. Now, we've tried those before. To the best of my knowledge, and let's see if I'm incorrect, there are 2 years of actual caps, 4 years of targets. The targets really don't do anything. So we have 2 years of caps, and those 2 years of caps would, in year one, to the best of my understanding, result in a $12 billion discretionary cut on paper. Do we agree with that number, that it's a $12 billion discretionary cut?
For 2024.
For 2024.
Yes.
So a $12 billion discretionary cut. But one thing that I think is important in that is you also have the COVID rescissions, which are $29 billion. However, $6 billion of that was actually rescinded. $22 billion was, to the best of my understanding, split into $11 billion in 24 and $11 billion in 25 and put over in commerce, and is sitting there able to be spent. Now, again, according to appropriations, but also not with respect to the cap. So we talk about a $12 billion cut, but you've got these rescissions that we're saying we're saving, the COVID rescissions, and we're taking 11 or 12 billion and putting it over in commerce. Do I have that correct, to the best of our knowledge? Any of the witnesses, can they speak to that's over in commerce?
I don't know where the money that went into commerce, for those two categories in commerce, came from.
Okay.
Whether that came out of the COVID money or what that was intended to come from.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Congressman Estes. My understanding is that it was in fact from that pot of COVID money that 22 billion was divided into two, and that's 11 billion per year. My point of that is, depending on how you view these numbers and the fact that that doesn't apply to the cap, I would argue that you're not necessarily seeing that $12 billion cut. This is why I have been saying to some degree in the public that this is effectively a spending freeze. So we can quibble over it, and at the end of the day, $12 billion represents what? 0.75% of the 1.6 trillion, roughly? So at most, we're talking about is about a 0.75% cut in 2024, but we have these COVID rescissions that we're moving around and putting over COVID. So from my standpoint, when I analyze this for the American people, I view this as effectively a spending freeze for 2 years. You get a 2-year spending freeze, but that is off of the post-COVID spending. So we're still tracking post-COVID spending as where we're starting from. And right now, we are now spending almost 50% more than we were at the beginning of COVID. So we've gone from, 4 trillion-ish to 6 trillion-ish or something along those lines. And in a post-COVID environment, we're now going to say we're freezing spending. So we're, as some articles have said, bending, the curve down. So we're bending the curve down off of the higher COVID levels of spending in order to extract an agreement to push the debt ceiling all the way to January 1st, 2025 in the middle of a lame duck, which by most accounts would amount to maybe 4 trillion-ish of increase. And I'm trying to figure out how that's good for the American people. That's what I'm trying to figure out. That's not exactly ratcheting back our spending. This is like watching the Indy 500 on Sunday and like you're going 240 down the stretch and you're going, oh, the curve's coming up and I'm just going to let my foot a little bit off the gas. But you could go barreling right through the curve right into the wall, and that's what we're doing. We're not making the substantive transformative changes necessary. We already acknowledged here, I think on a bipartisan basis, we're not touching mandatory spending in any significant way. I actually am fine with that in the current circumstances of this political environment, but I think we ought to be on a bipartisan basis actually sitting down to roll our sleeves up and address mandatory spending. Unfortunately, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, their only response ever to that is taxes. Literally, that's the response. Say, okay, well, let's talk about all that. Let's talk about overall revenue to the Treasury, and then talk about what we're going to do to reform mandatory spending. But we don't ever do that. But put that aside. In discretionary, we're talking about a freeze in spending post-COVID. And I think that I think is what a lot of the American people are concerned about. To the extent that I'm trying to put any meat on the bone of what my friend from South Carolina said about smoke and mirrors, is, these cuts, we're going to save $2 trillion over 10 years. Well, when the CBO says that, and I think this is correct, right, they are assuming that we're going to spend at those levels that are capped and the targets, which are not, of course, in law. They're just targets. So the $2 trillion is, like most things in this town, a fiction. It's just saying, well, if you guys do something remotely responsible like this, you'll save $2 trillion. if I heard one of my colleagues correctly earlier about the defense spending. The defense spending, it was critical of increasing defense while decreasing non-defense. Okay, I mean, my personal view was that we should have a top-line number here and then go duke it out in appropriations. Why isn't that better for us? I would ask everybody here. Why isn't it better to do like a normal family does and say, here's your number, now go figure it out in appropriations? Because I think one of the fundamental problems we have in this town is we keep playing games with these bifurcated caps, and we go, okay, we're gonna have 704 for non-defense, and we're gonna have whatever the number is, 800, whatever it is for defense. And you just get them sitting there. Why shouldn't we have one single cap and then duke it out in appropriations to figure out what's in the best interest of the American people? On both sides of the aisle, I'd be quite, any reason why that wouldn't be a better way to do things?
I think that would be a much better way to do it. I'm a big advocate that we ought to be following regular order and following the process of having the budget committee develop a budget and then having the appropriations committee and as well as the authorizing committees do their work and then move forward.
A question that came up when I was trying to look through this, and again, to Mr. Massey's point about trying to figure out how great it is, we've got 72 hours to review the bill. We're actually having time to actually go through it and find stuff in the bill. Even though it's 100 pages, it touches thousands of pages of code and complicated issues, so you got to go through and figure it out. And I still don't know all the answers to all this stuff. I'm trying to figure it out. 3 degrees, and they're pretty useless at this point, trying to sort through all this stuff. But right now, the claim is that it provides just $704 billion for non-defense. But if I understand things correctly, the agreement is such that 2 things are true. One, I already pointed out the COVID money, that there's $22 billion, I think spread out over 2 years, sitting there to be able to be applied back to backfill some of the NDD spending. So again, this $40 billion reduction in non-defense discretionary spending can in fact be backfilled by the COVID dollars. The second issue is that I believe there's IRS money that if it were to be claimed, in addition to the $1.4 billion out of $80 billion of IRS money that has been set aside this year, leaving $78.6 billion of the IRS expansion to go after poor and minority at a 3 to 5 times greater rate than they do everybody else, that if we're not going to go pull out the rest of that IRS money just because we should get rid of it, instead what we've said is no, we'll allow $20 billion of that to be set aside to then go out and then again backfill non-defense discretionary. So when my colleagues say it's a $40 billion reduction in non-defense discretionary, I would say, well, kinda, right? But people hear that and they think, well, we want to get rid of that IRS expansion, but we're actually reducing non-defense discretionary, saying, yeah, but we're setting this up for a backfill of the non-defense discretionary. Now, you might say, great, I want to move that $10 billion out of IRS expansion that was already sitting there, claw that back, and then go put it over here in the non-defense discretionary. Am I missing anything in all of this, or is that an accurate reflection of what we think is actually in the bill? Do we know? I'm asking because we're trying to figure all this out. You guys know? I think that's
in regards to the, it's not a Ways and Means issue, but in regards to that, I did not see anywhere in the bill where it talks about, using $20 billion. The more money we can get from that $80 billion of the IRS, I'd be supportive of, but I haven't seen that $20 billion in the bill that you're referring to. I've seen outside reports, but I've not seen in the bill.
I think you're correct. I do not believe that it is in the bill, but I've heard people try to tout that as like, look, we're taking $20 billion out of IRS. I 100% agree with you. I'd like to get rid of the entirety of the $80 billion IRS expansion, but we don't. We only get rid of $1.4 billion of it. We got rid of the entirety of the $80 billion IRS expansion in the Limit, Save, Grow Act. But I would note that, when we think about how the White House in their own reporting on the deal said this keeps non-defense spending roughly flat with the 2023 levels in 2024. When you factor in agreed upon appropriations adjustments, in 2025, it increases the non-defense spending levels and the defense spending levels by 1%. Now, is that true? That was the White House statement on the deal. Mr. Thompson or Mr. Boyle, do you know if the White House is correct that they say the deal keeps non-defense spending roughly flat with the 2023 levels in 2024 when you factor in agreed upon appropriations adjustments. I'm trying to square that with the claim that it's a $40 billion reduction in non-defense discretionary.
I'll say that is my understanding. I think you even cited the statistic when you add it all up. You're talking about a hair under 1%, maybe 3/4 of a percentage point. That's my understanding as well.
So I'm still not 100% clear whether the White House is correct in their characterization of it being flat or whether we're correct in saying it's a $40 billion reduction in non-defense discretionary. Either way, I've got concerns about the overall spending number, but that's part of the problem with these kinds of efforts when we do a deal over a weekend on Memorial Day and we're coming back and trying to figure it out. I am correct that the White House has called the 4-year targets, quote, non-enforceable appropriations targets. Do we agree that they're unenforceable? They're just 4-year targets that could be written on the, whiteboard in my office. So the question on the IRS, it does, to the best of my knowledge, leave 98% of the $80 billion IRS expansion intact, taking only $1.4 billion out of it. Do we agree that minority taxpayers are 3 times as likely to be audited by the Internal Revenue Service as other taxpayers, Mr. Smith?
Yeah, the data has showed that minorities have been audited by a higher percent.
And that CBS reports that the IRS audits the poor at 5 times the rate of everyone else, analysis finds. In other words, rich people have lawyers. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
If
Mr.
I might,
Bolser.
I would point out, even though this has gotten badly mischaracterized, a big reason why Democrats fought for, and I voted for, increased funding for the IRS, well, 2 reasons. First, as President Trump's own IRS commissioner testified to us when he was front of Ways and Means a couple years ago, the IRS workforce is so reduced compared to where they were 10 years ago, even just getting answers to the 1-800 number is almost impossible. Perhaps you're experiencing the same thing in your constituent service offices. One of the big complaints we have, and I have 3 district offices, and we process a lot of casework, dealing with the IRS has become a real challenge, just getting inquiries answered. And that problem has only gotten compounded since COVID. So that was the #1 reason for increased funding for the IRS. The second is exactly what the gentleman highlighted. It is cheaper for the IRS to audit low-income taxpayers because their tax returns are not nearly as complex as those in the wealthiest 1/10 of 1%. That wealthiest 1/10 of 1%, if I can just finish, have much more complex returns that require more agents, and particularly agents with real accounting expertise. That's wrong, and that's part of why we did need to boost funding for the IRS so they can bring more fairness to the system.
That's fine, but wouldn't the answer be, 1, to simplify the code, and 2, to make sure that the IRS is doing what they need to be doing efficiently? Now, I say this as a conservative whose dad worked for the Internal Revenue Service for 20 years. I actually know quite a bit about the Internal Revenue Service, inside and out. Mr. Smith, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, I will just say in the Limit, Save, Grow Act, we rescinded $72 billion. We left $8 billion of the $80 billion that the IRS highlighted for customer service and for updating the technology. So Republicans made that as a priority of technology, customer service, but we wanted to eliminate the $72 billion.
The bill, as we said, rescinds the $28 billion of COVID funds. I'm correct, though, that it leaves a significant chunk of the COVID funds intact, as opposed to rescinding all of the COVID funds. Again, we've had hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars of COVID funds. A remaining $50 billion is left, and we couldn't even rescind all of that. We rescind $28 billion, but we leave billions untouched. Some of the examples of funding left untouched include billions for things like vaccines, testing and mitigation, and genomic sequence and surveillance. The Limit, Save, Grow Act would have rescinded every single remaining dollar of COVID. I'm correct, right? We do not rescind every single dollar. We leave some intact. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Thanks, Mr. Estes. Student loans. This bill, to the best of my knowledge, simply restarts student loan repayment. payments after President Biden had frozen payments. But President Biden's already planned to resume student loan payments on September 1, I think. Is that correct? Do we know?
It is September. I can't recall if it's exactly September 1st, but it is September.
So we're completely relying, essentially, for those of us who believe that the student loan bailout should be rescinded, we're relying on the United States Supreme Court to overturn, effectively, the $500 billion student loan bailout. So whereas the Limit, Save, Grow Act had put that 400 and something billion, almost $500 billion, they had taken that out, and we'd eliminated that deficit in 2023, and then no longer made it to where the veteran will have to watch someone who did not sacrifice for this country get the same benefit he or she does under the GI Bill, and the plumber without a degree will have to subsidize his neighbor's master's degree. In gender studies, the Federal Reserve found that the average tuition increase associated with expansion of student loans is as much as 60 cents per dollar. According to the Brookings Institution, households with graduate degrees held 56% of outstanding education debt in 2019. 87% of Americans do not have federal student loan debt. Speaker Pelosi herself said, quote, people think the President of the United States has the power for debt forgiveness. He does not. He can postpone, he can delay, but he does not have the power. That has to be an act of Congress. My point of that is we have a chance here to right that wrong, and we're not. We're punting to the court. And I just think everybody ought to know that. I had a question here with Mr. Scott from Virginia like a week or two ago when we were debating the CRA on student loans. With all due respect to our Republican colleagues, it's really easy to pass a CRA. You know it's going to die in the Senate. The president's not going to sign. It's a lot harder to fight for it in a bill. And we punted. We punted because we punted to the United States Supreme Court. We have an obligation to defend the Constitution of the United States, and we're not doing it. We're taking a pass. And instead, as I said to Mr. Scott, my wife, who was a product of a single mom, went to Texas A&M, went to the University of Texas School of Law, took on debt, has worked her whole life the last 20 years, balancing being a mom, working to pay off those student loans, got it down to almost nothing. And we're just going to write $500 billion and say, here you go. And oh, by the way, we're doing that by an executive fiat that is unconstitutional. But we're going to punt our Article 1 responsibility to hold the executive responsible. We're going to kick it to Article 3. I don't see how that's something that we ought to be doing. The Secretary of Education has said, straight out that they're going to move forward and try to do what they can to continue doing the programs the best they can. The work requirements. The bill contains work requirements that do not include Medicaid. Is that correct? That's right? Now, Medicaid would have been the part that would have really significantly driven the effectiveness of work requirements, right? It would have been a more extensive and a larger both fiscal benefit and would have reached more people. Is that right? But the administration fought us on it, and we took a deal that didn't include Medicaid work requirements. So all this bill does, to the best of my understanding, is increase the upper age limit for existing work requirements for SNAP from 49 to 54, which, yeah, I'm in favor of that. But it strikes me as hardly something that we should be trumpeting as some massive reform with respect to work requirements. Relatively speaking, minor tweaks to the TANF program. There's a number of exclusions that are included for better or worse, but the fact is, in terms of the total application of numbers, it's going to be, 150-something thousand people by the time you net out exclusions out of the people that are added. Strikes me as a whole lot of bluster and a whole lot of discussion for, quote, work requirements in a bill that's going to increase the debt ceiling effectively $4 trillion. I would note that OMB Director Shalonda Young said, quote, we're not going to compromise our values, our work reforms. They are in the bill, but mind you, we've got new exemptions in the bill. There's clearly an effort by the administration to not want to apply the work requirements. The regulations my friend from South Carolina was talking about in the REINS Act have a weak administrative pay-go provision that is easily waived by OMB. Now, I know we think it's great because this is something that came out of the Trump administration by my friend Russ Vought former director of OMB, in terms of the structure. But the fact that it can be waived strikes me as a critically important problem. And I think Shalonda Young said, quote, if that waiver is deemed necessary to make sure President Biden's agenda is carried forward, we're going to use that authority, end quote. That strikes me as a fairly ineffectual regulatory reform. And a lot of folks on my side of the aisle have been talking about it having a $1.5 trillion impact because they went back and added up previous abuses of regulatory reform. And I would just point out that with that waiver, and as Ms. Young pointed out, they're going to use that authority. Permitting. This is one that I find particularly problematic. I would associate myself largely with the remarks from my friend from Texas, Mr. Burgess, Dr. Burgess. Look, I'm for NEPA reforms, 100%. We need them for road projects, transportation, but particularly for our energy industry. But my concerns here are that we've got language that none of us have fully reviewed going through the committees of jurisdiction that has been adopted, that I've got colleagues texting me and saying they're not 100% sure if that language is good or bad for the purpose intended. I've got colleagues on both sides of the aisle that have raised those questions. And so the purpose intended, of course, is to streamline projects, whatever those projects may be. But I've got a text right here from a GOP colleague saying, well, I'm not so sure that these will actually do what we think they will do to streamline said projects. And in fact, a former high up in the administration, in the energy department, under the Trump administration, just validated that concern by one of my colleagues. Yet we are putting forward this measure, saying this is some grand improvement with respect to NEPA, that's somehow something we should be applauding when it's not the full package of H.R. 1, which had gone through committee. And importantly, the one thing that I think is 100% clear is that this bill fails to include even the most basic reform to President Biden's unreliable energy subsidies that were put forward in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act for the wealthy, elites, corporations, and the Chinese Communist Party, just to be blunt. And frankly, it ensures that permitting reform will likely benefit renewables the most. Basically, if you're a government that is subsidizing the crap out of something, in this case, unreliable energy, giving massive subsidies to billion-dollar corporations, giving significant subsidies to families that make over $100,000 and $300,000 for EVs because you're chasing your dreams of, a fossil fuelless world, you're going to absolutely decimate our grid because you're not going to have the projects being developed for the gas and the coal and the nuclear that are actually required to keep your grid functioning. But yet that's what we're doing. And I just, for the life of me, can't understand why we're applauding that. And I would just note that President Biden's statement of administrative policy on this bill said, quote, the bill would protect and accelerate implementation of the historic clean energy and environmental justice investments in the Inflation Reduction Act, end quote. My question for my Republican colleagues here, or generally rhetorically, is how on earth is this going to be beneficial? Again, I go back to this. A spending freeze of 2 years for a $4 trillion increase of debt with actually a blank number into a lame duck Congress in order to not remotely address what the statement of administration policy is going around saying the bill would protect and accelerate implementation of the historic clean energy and environmental justice investments in the Inflation Reduction Act, which Goldman Sachs said would be $1.2 trillion. I'm just trying to figure out how this is a position that Republicans should put forward down on the floor of the House of Representatives, because that's the question before us. I'll just leave it out there as a rhetorical question. I know we've been here for a while. I do think it's, important. There are other pieces to this puzzle. I'm seeing out there in some of the, people talking about the bipartisan deal to avert the debt default won't constrain the Biden administration's ability to provide more aid to Ukraine. Look, this place works the way it works, and we all know it. This is my point about the COVID money that's been pocketed over at Commerce. the point about the IRS funds and how they might get shuffled around, the fact that the White House's statement said it's going to be a flat level of spending for the non-defense discretionary, because we all know how this town works. And with all due respect to the 99% deal, we're going to have a CR with a 1% reduction on January 1st. The fact is, all that's going to do is empower the establishment here in which we operate to jam through an omnibus spending bill right before Christmas. That's what will happen. That's what happens every year. And then the question will be, what is the check against that? Well, the check against that is right here. The check against that is whether or not we would support it or not. And so the question is, if you got something kicking in on January 1, that's 3 months after the fiscal year ends, as the break of a 1% reduction, which, by the way, would simply be a $15 billion cut, which is basically what we're talking about in this supposed caps deal governing what we're doing. The fact is, this is a $4 trillion increase with no teeth. None. We're still going to come back and have an appropriations battle. The likelihood of getting appropriations bills passed by October 31st, September 30th, October 31st, November 30th, are pretty slim based on past history, either side of the aisle. But we'll go through the process. Hopefully we'll navigate through it. But if we don't, the fact is there will almost certainly be an omnibus effort. And then there'll just be a debate about who is the big winner. And we all know who the big winner will be. Government, not the American people. We're not going to reduce spending through this deal unless we actually stand up and reduce spending. It'll be on us to choose to. But this deal isn't going to reduce spending, even though everybody's going around saying it will. And this deal isn't going to do anything but guarantee that in 2 years, actually 18 months, Mr. Massey's clock that he wears on his jacket is going to say 36 trillion. The last point that I'll make is just, I've talked about the statement of administration policy, is there's a significant number of folks who've been out talking about this bill. And I would just note that whether you've got Biden's economic advisor, Ramanurti, I think, due respect to pronouncing it correctly, this, quote, protects all the key pieces of legislation that the president signed into law in the last 2 years and preserves remarkable progressive accomplishments, end quote. I could go down a list of other quotes. The ever-important policy genius, Keith Olbermann, Biden has still kicked McCarthy's butt. Now he must also kick Joe Manchin's butt and his pipeline out of the debt deal. Well, my friend from Texas, I think, has an amendment along those lines, Mr. Self. Look, we ought to do better. The Limit, Save, Grow Act was a responsible approach to actually reduce spending, to actually change the way this town works. And with all due respect to my Democrat colleagues, happy to have a conversation anywhere, anytime with any of my Democratic colleagues about what we want to do to deal with our fiscal problems. But this was a small down payment, even in the Limit, Save, Grow Act. This doesn't represent any material change in the direction of where this country is going in terms of spending. A massive increase of debt was sort of a blip on the radar. But even the Limit, Save, Grow Act is just nibbling around the edges of what needs to be done. I don't understand how my colleagues can go to the steps of the Capitol and have all these groups from their middle school and elementary school and high school and talk to them about all the future of this country and where we're headed, when each and every one of them has a $100,000 debt payment attached to them. It's extraordinary. I think the American people demand more from us. Somebody said in here that things in here around here should not be decided by one person in a room. Well, I agree. I think part of the things that were working well for 4 or 5 months around here was a great greater amount of collaboration. But, you know, when deals are cut, as they were this weekend, the Rules Committee does provide a function that I interpret slightly differently than my friend from Kentucky. We're also the filter, not unlike, say, the Calendars Committee in the Texas legislature, of making sure that what gets to the floor is not something that steamrolls the American people, because the defense establishment in this town and those that wish to continue to spend money for every government program under the sun, as has been happening throughout my entire life watching it, there is an important role here to defend the American people against what this town does to them. Because this town does it to them every single year. So we got some work to do, and unless I see some amendments come through that improve this bill, I've got strong concerns. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The gentleman